Okay, so this evening I want to welcome everybody to the virtual Missouri Livestock Symposium. As we have another fantastic speaker with us this evening. We'll introduce him in just a second. I'm Zach Irwin, Vice Chairman of the Missouri Livestock Symposium. I just want to give a quick thank you to all of our sponsors for this year's virtual symposium. Many of them have been with us a long time. So I would invite anybody to go to MissouriLivestock.com and check out our virtual trade show and support those that have supported us throughout the years. I think at this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague and also somebody that's been an integral part of the committee, Valerie Tate. Valerie's Extension Agronomy Specialist with the University of Missouri Extension. Valerie, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Zach. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce Jim Gerrish. He is going to talk to us tonight about grazing management for targeted animal performance. I had the pleasure of knowing Jim for a long time, probably longer than I really want to admit, but I met him when I started working at the Forage Systems Research Center on my master's project about 5 years ago, long time ago. And then came back and worked at the center as a research specialist while he was there, and we worked on several projects. And I am really glad that I had the opportunity to work with him. I learned a lot from him, and glad that we can share some information tonight. He moved to Idaho, I think, to follow his dream to be an independent consultant, and left MU, the Forage Systems Research Center, about 15 years ago, probably. And so we're glad you could join us tonight, Jim. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Valerie. Let me get my screen shared here. All right, can you see that screen?
You need to put it in presentation mode. We're seeing the screen that has, there you go.
That's the one you want, and you can hear me.
Looks good, sounds good, thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Valerie. I'll go ahead and say, hey, it's great to be back in Missouri again, even though I'm only there virtually. I've been to the Livestock Symposium at Kirksville in real life several times. So I kind of know what the atmosphere is, and hopefully there's a few people on the webinar tonight that I know from back in those days, and hopefully there's some people who've never seen or heard me before. So I'll get underway. Thanks again, happy to be here. I used to call this presentation Grazing Management for High Animal Performance. But you know what? We don't necessarily always need to have high performance. So we changed it more to the notion of targeted performance. So when we talk about animal performance, we need to understand what really drives it. And when it comes to cattle grazing, sheep grazing, the primary driver of performance is their daily forage intake. How much do they eat? This is the basic deal. The more you eat, the fatter you get. When we look at factors that control intake, there's three primary ones that we have to think about. That's the time spent grazing, the animal's biting rate, and then the size of the bite. So we're going to look at each one of these in a little more detail and think about how our management can affect this or not affect it. We'll see. So we generally, you've probably heard it said that cattle are unionized, that they graze for 8 hours, ruminate for 8 hours, rest for 8 hours a day. It's not that perfectly cut and dried, but they do have to split their time every day between those activities. Cattle will typically graze 5 to 10 hours a day. If you have really nice pasture conditions, everything's right, they can pretty well meet all their needs in as little as 5 hours of grazing. When they're in that kind of casual grazing mode, there's abundant forage, they can take big bites, they'll take 15 to 20,000 bites a day. Now, if we either leave them on short grass or we put them on a new pasture that hasn't fully recovered in its short grass, well, they're still going to graze somewhere in that 5 to 10 hours per day. It's going to be up towards 10 hours. They will increase their biting rate. When they have tall forage in front of them, say anywhere from, 6 to 18, 20 inches, they really do a lot of action with their tongue. They extend their tongue, sweep a wad of forage to their mouth, shear it off, and they get great big bites. When they're on short grass like this and they have to start biting like a sheep, where they're using their set of teeth and the dental pad, they cannot get very much feed in each bite, but they will ramp up that biting rate to about 45,000 pounds, or 45,000 bites in a day. But 45,000 of those little sheep bites going into the cow or steer is never going to match what 15, 20,000 bites of big wads of forage are going to do. We can also get to this kind of a situation where the forage is really low quality, low digestibility, a lot of lignified stems in it, and they cannot push their hours of grazing to just keep eating this stuff, because if it's not being digested in the rumen and not passing through, they kind of stuff up, and they can starve to death at belly deep in grass because the rumen's not working right and it won't flow through. In ideal pasture conditions, sheep will graze 6 to 8 hours a day. Now remember that sheep have a very active tongue. They have prehensile lips. They can bite individual leaves off of a plant. They can bite individual seed pods off of a plant and things like that. So sheep from the start are consuming, their intake is generally higher quality forage. They can, and 40,000 bites is typical in a situation like this. Now sheep, in contrast to cattle, because they can be so selective in their biting, they can actually extend their grazing out for several hours more than what cattle can do, and still get decent performance out of them because each bite they're taking is that much higher in quality. So as you know, sheep and cattle are ruminants. It's kind of a batch processing digestive system. Horses, on the other hand, horses can graze in excess of 20 hours a day. They are not ruminants. They're more of a flow-through feed system. Technically, we call them hindgut fermenters. This is the basic reason why horses can be so damaging to pasture, is because they can graze and graze and graze and graze. And with their jaw and teeth set up, they can graze very close to the ground, much closer to the ground than what cattle can do. So these are the kind of things about intake that we need to understand if we're going to make good management decisions with grazing. It really comes down to that bite size is what we can control and manage for. There's limits on the time they can spend grazing. There's a maximum biting rate that they can get to, and that's generally in association with low forage availability. So our job, if we want high animal performance, or if we're just working for an appropriate level of performance with a dry cow, what we're really trying to manage is the size of the bite. Now, we'll come back to that later. All right, so we have different types of livestock, different species of animals, different classes. They're at different stages of production, and they live in different environments. Every one of these animals, in this series of pictures, and we could put up 100 more pictures, and they're going to have somewhat different intake needs, different nutrient needs. So we manage them differently depending on what that demand is. When we are looking at animal performance, generally it is energy content of the pasture that's going to limit their performance. In cool season pastures, just quite frankly, you got to screw up pretty badly to make a cool season pasture be protein deficient. Now, warm season grasses are a different story, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But generally, when we think about performance category, we're basing it on energy. Most rank and file farmers and ranchers are probably more familiar with the term TDN, total digestible nutrients, than they are the net energy system that a lot of dairy farmers use. So I'm going to be looking at this in the context of the TDN available in the pasture that the animals can consume. When we think about animals that have very high energy requirements, lactating dairy cows and nanny goats, using nannies, nursing twins and triplets, and then finishing beef animals 100% on pasture takes high energy level. For marbling to occur, there has to be energy in excess of the animal's maintenance and growth needs. So when it comes to grass-fed beef or pasture-finished beef, we need to have a very high, which I bracket at 60 to 68% TDN. We have lactating beef cows, finishing lambs, and growing stockers at a rate greater than 2 pounds a day. Now, some people just want to equate growing stockers over 2 pounds a day and pasture finishing. They are not the same thing. Finishing implies marbling, and marbling takes more energy than it does to just have, say, a 7-weight stocker gaining 2 pounds a day. Moderate energy level at 54 to 60% TDN, mid to late lactation beef cows, replacement heifers, ewe lambs, stockers gaining at 1 to 2 pounds a day. And then the low energy group, that's pretty well dry pregnant adult animals or mature bulls that are being overwintered, and stockers gaining less than 1 pound per day. You know, some people like to rough their stockers through the winter and then capitalize on compensatory gain in the spring, which if you're growing stockers and they're bound for the feedlot, there's nothing wrong with doing that. It can be a good moneymaker. If you are planning on finishing these animals on pasture, though, you don't want them, gaining at that lower rate. And that's a whole different talk. I'll just leave it at that and we'll move on. So we look at our animal demand primarily in the sense of energy. Yes, we do need to pay attention to the protein and make sure that it's there adequate. But it's actually easier and more cost effective to supplement protein so that the rumen will function better and gain more energy out of their diet than it is to substitute feeding energy to the animal. From research we did at FSRC, some of which Valerie was part of, and from a lot of different studies around the country, around the world, we know with beef cattle that forage intake will maximize if the sward height, the pasture height, is between about 6 and 15 inches. Now, R squared is a statistical term that means what percent of one factor, the variation in one factor is explained by another. A lot of people would call this correlation, and in farm and ranch world, yeah, I'll call it correlation, though technically it's not. But what we found in that work we did was the condition of the pasture when we put the animals into it, what we would call pre-grazing forage mass. That explains about 23% of the variation in different sets of cattle grazing through pastures. 82% of the variation is explained by the post-grazing residual, what you leave behind. You look at that fresh paddock on the left side of the screen. I think every farmer, rancher, cowboy can look at that and say, oh, that's about the right stage to put cattle into that pasture. The problem is a whole lot of folks do not recognize when to take them out of the pasture. And that's where they get disappointing animal performance, especially in stocker grazing. Since I've been in the consulting business, which is 17 plus years now. I've worked with a lot of producers all across the country, range environments, eastern pasture environments, irrigated pasture environments, people who have problems in their stocker operations, can't understand why they're not getting the performance that they want. And I would say at least 75% of those clients that I visit that have disappointing stocker performance, it comes down to leaving them on a paddock too long, grazing it too short, and thereby restricting intake. The easiest way to increase the intake of any grazing animal is leave more residual. The willingness to waste grass is a key point to getting high animal performance. Now, this whole concept of wasting grass, you know, what we believe, we teach and try to get out is, first thing is grass feeds the grass. Grass then feeds the soil. And in the end, grass can feed the livestock. But we have to take care of the grass itself and the soil first. So even though I say, if you want to get high animal performance on stockers, you got to be willing to waste grass. That grass that you're wasting is building the production factory that you will have to work with in the future. When we look at cool season pastures, which of course tall fescue, orchard grass, brome, timothy, bluegrass, those are all cool season forages. The control of grazing intake is about 75% based just on the availability of the pasture and only about 25% on the quality of the pasture. And that's because, as I said, cool season forages typically are going to have adequate protein in them to keep rumen function properly working. When we look at warm season grasses, on the other hand, though, it's an even split. You got to pay just as much attention to the quality stage that forage is at when you're grazing it as you do the availability. And as we get more mature forages, or if we're grazing in the dormant season, that protein level in the forage becomes increasingly important. That's why with warm season grasses, we say it's an even split, managing for high forage availability and appropriate forage quality. Now this figure here is, we did not do this work at Linnaeus. This is from Ed Rayburn when he was at Cornell University. And what it illustrates is the relationship of grazing intake to forage availability. So that relative intake at 100%, that is the maximum capacity of the rumen of the animal. They simply could not have a higher level intake because of physical limitations. On the bottom axis, we have the forage availability, and you'll see that basically no animals, no cattle can maintain maximum intake capacity at forage availabilities much lower than a ton per acre. We get pretty good performance going down there to that 80% intake level, and then it falls off very, very quickly, which is at about 1,000 pounds residual to the acre. So if you look at this and understand it, it's easy to see why disappointing stocker performance occurs when we leave animals on a pasture too long. Now, most commercial operations, commodity operations, because we know that stocking rate on the land is a primary determinant of profitability, we have to have, so many animals out there to be able to pay our bills. Almost no commercial operations operate at a goal of 100% intake capacity. Economically, the appropriate stocking rates generally have your animals grazing at 80 to 90% of their capacity. The only enterprise in the beef sector where we ever try to maximize intake to get 100% of their capacity and genetic potential is doing grass-fed beef, because the rate of gain directly affects the quality of the finish, which directly affects the price you're going to receive for that product. but most of the time we're operating at something less than maximal intake. This slide here is from research that we did at Linnaeus, and it's looking at the daily intake. These cattle, this one is for orchard grass alfalfa. We did this study on both big blue stem pastures and orchard grass alfalfa. We had 3-day grazing periods, weekly grazing periods, and I think we had daily and a longer one, and basically set stocking also. The most interesting one in there is this weekly rotation. We look at day 1 on the pasture, and we see animals eating at 4% of their body weight intake. Now, if we had steers that could do that day after day after day, they'd be gaining 7 pounds a day. We know that doesn't happen. So why do we have such a high intake first day in a new pasture? Easiest thing to do is you look at the last 3 days in that grazing period, and the red dashed line just under 2%, that's maintenance level. For 3 days on that pasture, they're basically eating at maintenance. The rumen has emptied out. We put them to a fresh pasture that has a lot of availability, feed availability in it, and a lot of high quality feed in it. So on the first day, because they have a lot of rumen capacity, because they haven't eaten very well for a few days, they can binge feed and eat a tremendous amount. All right, so if you were to look at this picture and say, if I wanted to get higher animal performance out of this, what should I do? Well, the obvious answer is you move them on, day 4. You don't let them go all the way down to that maintenance grazing level. And if you do that, the first day intake isn't as high. The slope of that decline over the grazing period is much lower. If you were to look at that intake pattern on a 3 or 4 day grazing period, and I ask the same question, what would you do to improve animal performance here? The obvious answer is, well, I'd move them every day. And daily moves will really keep intake high as long as you recognize and understand that there is a limit to how much forage you can graze off of that pasture in that day and still maintain that target level of intake. And that target level of intake at over this period, this is from the same study, it's just looking at the data in a different way. So all of these pastures started with about 3,400 to 3,600 pounds of dry matter per acre in the pasture. And we're looking at what would the residual forage need to be to maintain 2.5% rate of intake, which is a moderate level of performance, over with a 1-day grazing period, a 2-day, a 3-day, on up to a week long. And what we see is, just from a standpoint of maintaining intake with a daily rotation, we could use about 2/3 of the standing forage and still keep animal performance at our target level. Jump over there to a week-long grazing period, and we can only use about 1/3 of the forage to maintain that level of intake. Now, this isn't rocket science, this isn't higher level math. If you can use 2/3 of the standing forage compared to 1/3 of the forage, you can run twice as many animals on that land and get the same level of performance. Now, we have to be thinking about the plants and the soil here also. The reason we can't exactly do that doubling, going from a week to a daily rotation, is because 2/3 utilization and grazing it all the way down to just over 1,000 pound residual in a Missouri summer heat and dry conditions is not going to be conducive for pasture regrowth and soil health. So we have to balance animal needs, plant needs, soil needs against our financial needs. So what we know is increasing biting rate will not compensate for low intake per bite. You cannot graze a pasture repeatedly short like this and expect to get good animal performance, because the animals just physically cannot consume enough forage each day to perform at that level. these next few slides are going to illustrate what I would consider near optimal grazing conditions. So this pasture here is high in phase 2. Orchard grass, which is one of the earlier maturing grasses. We see seed heads on it. This pasture, this is from just right out the window here on our irrigated pasture. There's also meadow brome grass, smooth brome grass, timothy, western wheatgrass, tall fescue, all out there. And other than the bluegrass, pretty well all of those are going to head a little bit later than the orchard grass. So this is high phase 2. It's about 12 to 14 inches tall. And on this day, you know, I had estimated there was 32 to 3,400 pounds of dry matter per acre out there. To me, this is real good growth stage to let cattle in on the pasture. This is what I would call a phase 2 residual. If you look at it, there's a lot of green leaf there. You don't see the soil surface down below this. This is about 4 to 5 inches tall. And this is probably about a 60% utilization on this pasture. One thing that has really changed in my life since I left Missouri and came to Idaho, those of you remember, you know, talks I gave from when I was in Missouri and, you know, years ago, I always talked about take half, leave half. And in the Missouri environment, that worked very, very well for us for maintaining good ground cover, good diversity, good productivity in the pastures. I graze under center pivots now. Basically, I make it rain 3/4 of an inch every 3rd day. And when you know you can do that, yes, you can push a pasture a little harder. So I do a lot more 60, 65% grazing now than what I used to do because of our capacity to put water out there. But to me, this is a good residual. It's good for the plants. We've left leaf surface, so active photosynthesis is going to kick back into gear. The pasture is going to recover quickly because we've left the soil covered. We've kept it cooler. It's good for the soil. We haven't broken the flow, the direct flow of photosynthetic energy to the soil microbes. So we have good microbiology going on. And because we're not asking the animals to eat down to a short level and lower quality, less digestible materials, we go deeper, it's good for the livestock also. This is what we call the win-win-win situation. And it's all based on your willingness to waste grass. Now, here's what happens when you're not willing to waste grass and you leave those animals out there another day. Now we're down into a phase 1 residual. This is just 1 to 3 inches. You see very little green leaf cover remaining out there. You see more of the soil surface. So what we see happening here is it's bad for the plants, bad for the soil, bad for the livestock. This is not the path you want to go down. This is how a whole lot of folks go broke. This is one of those easy rule of thumb guidelines that I use. We call it iced and austral. And this first animal that we see here, you see its nostrils while it's grazing. If you can look at a bovine and see its nostrils while it's grazing, I'll pretty well guarantee you that intake is being restricted because the size of the bite's too small. Now here, we cannot see the eyes of the livestock, and you can see a lot of seed heads out here. In this situation, rate of intake is probably being restricted by the quality of the forage. We have enough indigestible fiber here that we're slowing down rate of passage, and that's reducing their intake level. So optimally, if when you put animals into the pasture, you can't see their nostrils as they're grazing, but you can clearly see their eyes, we're probably optimizing intake at this level. All right, so we've talked about the volume of feed that they consume and how that's going to affect their performance. Now let's switch gears and talk about nutrient density. This is what is in that bite that they're taking. I already referred to energy as being our primary concern. what's generally going to be a limiting performance. However, we do need enough protein to always keep the rumen properly functioning. And then we have minerals, vitamins, other factors that are coming from that forage that need to go into the animal's diet. What we really want is pasture that tastes great and is more filling. So what is excellent pasture? It's high in energy, adequate in protein, mineral rich. The next line I have here is species diverse. And that species diverse ties right back in with that mineral rich. When I was in Missouri, I quite frankly didn't worry a whole lot about what the mineral content of the soil, the forages were. Those North Missouri soils are pretty young soils. You know, that was under glacier, I think, what was it, as recently as 10,000 years ago. So there's a lot of unweathered base minerals in those soils. As I've worked around the country in a lot of other situations, I have been to a lot of places where the soil is just badly degraded, very low mineral content. So I think a lot more about the role of minerals in animal health and well-being and performance these days. And I know that one of the keys to putting a lot of minerals in front of the animals is plant species diversity, because each of those plants has a somewhat different mineral composition. And so the broader the diversity we put in front of them, the more minerals we can have in front of them. When we look at energy and protein, though, by having diversity, we're more likely to have green, actively photosynthesizing leaves more days of the year, which means higher energy. By having legumes in here, we're going to elevate the protein level also. So that species diverse affects all three of those factors we have above it. We talk about palatability. We used to think palatability meant that it just tasted good and animals like to eat it. The work that Fred Provenza and his colleagues did at Utah State University and then their colleagues around the world, we now know that palatability is much more about metabolic feedback. What does a bite of something make an animal feel? Does it make them feel perky and happy? Does it make them feel sick? The animals can sense those things almost immediately as they're eating these different forages. So palatability is something that they want to eat because it makes them feel good. And then we like it to be durable. If any of you have seeded a pasture recently or looked at the price of forage seed, it's way more expensive to seed a pasture now than it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago. I very often have said, and many of you have probably heard me say it, that I think seeding a pasture is something you should do once in your lifetime. If you do that, put in adapted mix, manage it effectively, those plants should persist and be there for years and years and years. Plus, that sward is going to diversify with natural encroachment of adapted species there. But I don't want to be tearing something up and reseeding it every few years. I want it to be there for a lifetime. And that brings us to this here. This stuff doesn't happen by accident. It must be created. It's created through our management. And we'll finish up with that several minutes down the road. Okay, so if we think about factors affecting forage quality, the number one factor is plant maturity. This is especially true in grasses. As an illustration here, when we're looking at cool season grasses, on average, they lose about 0.5% of digestibility per day each day past the boot stage. That boot stage is just before the seed head pops out. That last little leaf comes off the stem up there, what we call the flag leaf. From that day on, it loses quality fast. In 3 weeks' time, a pasture will go from being finishing quality feed to just being, late lactation cow feed. So we, part of our objective in our grazing management is minimizing reproductive growth in the cool season grasses. On your non-native subtropical warm seasons, things like Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, Klein grass, the decline in digestibility is even faster than that 0.5% per day. Some of the lower quality Bermuda grasses they lose over 1% in digestibility each day. So this is a pretty clear-cut picture right here. On the right-hand side of the picture, where it says maintenance quality feed, this picture was taken at the end of July, and the mountains in the background, obviously this is in the Missouri pasture. This is one of our irrigated pastures. And I still managed to screw up my grazing management sometime. And we have 450 acres under pivot. I had about 100 acres one year that I didn't get around to grazing on the first cycle and just let it go. So this is end of July. That's the full season growth out there. That it says maintenance quality feed, but it's late lactation feed. I did run cows and calves on that 100 acres for almost 50 days. It was 45 or 46 days. And we came out with 40-pound lower weaning weights than what we had historically been doing on these irrigated pastures. That's what that 45 days of putting cow-calf pairs on this low quality feed did. What's on the left-hand side of the picture was grazed back in the middle of June. And so that regrowth out there, that's good quality feed. That's finishing feed, dairy quality feed out there. So our timing of grazing or severity of use really affects what our future forage supply and quality is going to be. Species makes a difference, just some real broad generalities here. In general, annuals are higher quality than perennials. Cool season forages are higher quality than warm season forages. Now, warm seasons, and we'll break this out a little bit later again, we have the native prairie grasses and we have introduced subtropicals. The native warm season grasses are much more comparable in digestible energy to cool seasons than are the subtropicals. And then it shows legumes higher than grasses. Let's look at exactly what that means. From a standpoint of energy, annuals are almost always going to be higher in a digestible energy than perennials are. You know, interesting contrast, annual ryegrass versus perennial ryegrass. Perennial ryegrass is always talked about as being a high energy grass. Well, annual ryegrass is pretty well going to beat it all the time. Legumes, and I want to emphasize at comparable stage of maturity. I mean, if we compare headed out perennial ryegrass, headed out annual ryegrass to vegetative perennial ryegrass, the perennial is going to be higher quality. So we always, when we make these comparisons, is at comparable stages of maturity. Legumes carry higher digestible energy later into maturity, typically than the grasses. That energy here I show cool season grasses, warm season grasses actually being comparable in energy content. I want to emphasize this is talking about the native warm season prairie grasses. Generally, with the introduced subtropicals, they are going to be lower energy than cool season grasses at comparable stage of maturity. When it comes to protein, annuals are higher protein content than perennials. Legumes are pretty well always going to be higher in protein than grasses. And cool season perennial grasses at comparable stages of maturity are always going to be higher than warm season perennial grasses in protein. So we started out, we're talking about targeted animal performance. So let's think about what winter annual forages can do for you. It extends the quality grazing season later into the fall. Also lets you get cattle out on pasture earlier in the spring. It provides finishing or dairy quality pasture when you normally don't have it. That is the power of winter annuals. And we generally think in terms of 2 to 3 weeks earlier in the spring compared to your perennial pastures. And in the fall of the year, it just really depends on the climate. Some places it's just a 2 to 3 week extension. Some places it's a 2 to 3 month extension that annuals can provide. What can summer annual forages do? Well, it's very similar. It's just at a different time of year. provides productive forage in midsummer. Dairy and finishing quality feed at a time when it's usually in short supply. If you're in basically an infected tall fescue system, you don't have a whole lot of good quality feed on the place in July and August. Summer annual forages can put you right back in a power position of high animal performance in the summer months. It can also be carried into the winter as dry cow feed. Out here in Idaho, cursor working. All right. I'm back now. Good. Okay. I was just going to say that out here in the West, some people are starting to grow these summer annual forages on irrigated land solely for the purpose of stockpiling it for winter feed. Okay. I've got a little delay in my slides advancing here. Not sure why that is. Okay, I'm going to see if I can exit out of this, restart it at this point. Okay, I'm going to restart. We've seen those things. All right. So this quality stage here, this is a warm season annual mix. You can see some sorghum. You can see some millet in here. Probably have a little crabgrass, cowpea, some other things going on. This is one of our finishing clients in California. When you are in a vegetative stage or actively growing, cool season, warm season grasses, they are high quality feed, period. We just can use them for any class of livestock that we want. Now, maturity, we're back to this point. On the left-hand picture, we have sorghum Sudan that's being grazed at 30 to 36 inches with high performance animals. You got to capture at that point. When it gets at 60 inches, it's pretty well cow feed. And that's what we're seeing there on the right-hand picture. Same thing with cereal rye. In March in Missouri, cereal rye can be a great forage, but by May, it's basically straw. So timing of grazing, aggressiveness of grazing is very important when you're using annual cover crops. Diversity in the mix is one of the ways that we broaden the window of quality availability to get performance out of it. I imagine several people in this session are mixed crop and livestock farmers who are doing cover crops. You know, the big push over the last 8 to 10 years has been increasing the diversity of those cover crops for soil health factors, for stimulating soil biology, but they're also, that diversity is very good for spreading out the quality window for grazing. Each time we graze off an annual forage, if there's regrowth potential, basically we restart the quality curve. So recovery on this sorghum Sudan here and millet mix, 20 to 30 days from now is going to be very good. Plant part is the final factor that we think about in terms of determining forage quality. This is where we get into leaves versus stems. The goodies are pretty well in the leaves. That's where your highest protein content is. It's where the soluble sugars are. It's where the bioavailable minerals are. So the more leaves that the animals can consume, the higher the quality, the nutrient density of the forage is going to be. But we need to have a certain amount of stem there for fiber to keep the rumen functioning. We talk about the first and second bite. I'll illustrate that here. When animals first come into a new pasture and they're just biting the upper part of the plant, that is very high energy, very high protein. As they take a second bite, it's going to be a lower leaf to stem ratio. The energy content is going to be lower. The protein content is going to be lower. And I got a third bite pictured here, but you know what? That third bite really belongs to the plant and the animal, and you should leave that alone. Several years ago, I started hearing on some of the grazing forums, people making the claim that the energy is at the top of the plant and the protein is at the bottom of the plant. I have absolutely no idea where anybody ever got that notion. From FSRC, you know, we have hundreds, probably thousands of stratified forage samples that just solidly show both the upper part of the plant is higher in both protein and energy. They're not offset from each other. This work happens to be from Jason Roundtree at Michigan State University, with the green bar being the upper third of the plant, the red bar, the middle third, the blue bar, the lower third. And you can just see each bite you take deeper into the plant canopy, the lower both energy and protein are. And as a matter of fact, looking at the ratio of protein to energy, the most favorable energy to protein ratio is in the bottom third of the plant, not the top of third of the plant, as you know some people were saying. So just keep that in mind, that really protein and energy are highest in the upper part of the plant. Typical cool season forages that we might choose to use going to be the cereal grains and then annual ryegrass. There's several different winter annual legumes that, you know, I think the only one of these that I did not grow at any time in Missouri was the arrowleaf clover. It is widely used across South Missouri. So these are, all these things I'm putting up here are adaptable and usable in Missouri. The Brassicas, which includes turnips, kale, Swedes, radishes, rape, things like that. High quality feed, fast establishing, can produce a lot of volume of feed. Personally, I prefer to have like oats or ryegrass in with that rather than just straight brassica, but a lot of people use it as a straight brassica. We look at the summer annual grasses, and the biggest summer annual grass of all is corn. Corn can readily be grazed during the active growing season or stockpiled for winter feed. Probably my favorite of all summer annual grasses from when we were in Missouri is crabgrass, because it just kind of happens. It is a beautiful companion plant with tall fescue, very high quality feed, very palatable. We got the sorghums, the millets, the other weedy grasses like foxtail, barnyard grass. If you know how to utilize barnyard grass and foxtail, they're actually pretty darn good feed. They have to be grazed aggressively though, in a timely manner. Some annual legumes, annual lespedeza, you know, soybeans. If anybody's ever had cows get out in a soybean field, they don't turn their nose up at it. They just turn their tongue loose on it, and they'll eat that right up. Various peas and beans. So the warm season cover crops during the summer, high in energy, moderate in protein. It's high performance feed, great to have. As we move towards fall though, energy content drops off fairly quickly because it's not getting as intense a sunlight as what it did in the summer. So it's more suitable for cow-calf pairs, replacement heifers, dry dairy cows. So all annuals at some point in their growth stage seem to take off real fast, much faster than we're used to seeing in perennial pastures. So if you're going to use annuals effectively, you need to understand that they're going to take off know what that rate's going to be, when it's going to mature, how that's going to affect animal performance, and then adjust your time of use, severity of use to try to capitalize on the quality that's in the forage for the animal class that you're looking for. This is what gets a lot of people in trouble with warm season annuals. They don't start soon enough, they don't graze it aggressively enough, and pretty soon it's like a jungle. You can't even see the cattle in there, but you can hear them crashing through the brush, just like elephants in the jungle. This is what I consider the reasonable starting point for grazing warm season cocktails. Another one of those rule of thumb guidelines I use is hip to knees. Don't let it get over your hip. Don't graze it shorter than your knees. And if you can keep that pasture working in that kind of hip to knee height, you'll get good recovery on it. Forage quality will be good. They'll eat it quite well. Animal performance will be right there where you want it. For those of you who are using cover crops as part of a mixed crop and livestock system, remember part of the purpose of this cover crop is to improve the soil. So we have to think about what should you leave behind. In a wet environment like Missouri or Iowa, I would want at least a ton of dry matter per acre left out on the field, for the soil. In a drier environment, we want at least 1,000 pounds. We have some places where people are using cover crops where it's only about 1,100 to 1,200 pounds per acre is the total yield. And so we're asking them to just use a small percentage of it and leave more behind. Now, one thing about annuals that's important to always remember, typically the more residual you're going to leave, the higher the animal performance is going to be. The more severely you use it, the lower the performance is going to be. All right, so finishing up here, for creating and utilizing excellent pasture to get the animal performance level that we want, on the left side, we got our management objectives: maximize photosynthesis, optimize energy flow to the soil, create biodiversity above and below ground, create organic matter, enhance the water cycle, enhance the nutrient cycles. How do we do that? The basic management strategies that we use are short grazing periods, leave appropriate residual, allow adequate recovery, broaden biodiversity, and strengthen soil health. And with that, I think I'll close the presentation part of it, and hopefully, oh, hell, there's a book ad, and then there's some contact information. So I'm going to stop my share, turn it back to either Zach or Vala, and hopefully we have time for a few questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim. Very, very good information. Did have so anybody that's on the call, if you have a question that you'd like Jim to respond to, please use your chat function. We are going to be monitoring that. And so if something you saw in there brought you to thinking about a question, please enter that. So Jim, one question that we had was submitted early ahead of time. And I know this is a little bit off base from what you were discussing tonight, but I know you've got a great deal of experience in water systems. So this individual was talking about recommendations for mobile water systems for freezing temperatures.
Okay. Part of this hinges on, how many animals we're talking about. For years on our farm in Missouri, I shut water off using over the surface pipeline and movable Rubbermaid tanks. I shut the water off in the evening, restarted it in the morning, and life wasn't perfect, but we got on with it. And for that was running 60, 70, 80 cow type deal. If you're looking at watering a larger number of animals, there are options for portable tanks, and we sell one that's 1,000-gallon unit that can be equipped with a solar panel and solar pump on top. And the way the pump works is when it shuts off, it drains out. And, you know, these were developed in, there's one brand that's made in Canada and another at Gillette, Wyoming. And those are two pretty cold places. And, you know, we have customers who use those kind of systems in severe winter environments. I'm still a biologist, not an engineer. So, you know, I can't explain exactly how they do this, but the key to it is that when the tank fills and the solar pump shuts off, the pump and the supply line drain back out. So that is one way of doing it.
Gotcha. So again, I'll just remind everybody, we've got a few minutes left. If you've got any questions, please put them in the chat function.
Jim, you mentioned when you were talking about warm season grasses, you talked about native warm season grasses and subtropical warm season grasses, but you never really that I caught talked about what is a subtropical warm season grass?
Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, Klein grass. I'm not sure which other ones, you know, ever made it to South Missouri, but I think Bermuda and Bahia did, and probably some Klein grass. One class of warm seasons I didn't mention was the old world blue stems. This would be like Caucasian blue stem, King Ranch. Those, they are not subtropicals. They come from a temperate region in Asia, similar to the southern plains of the US. And from a quality standpoint, most of the old world blue stems fall in between our tall grasses, our big blue stem Indian grass, Cytodes grama, and the subtropicals. Pretty well in Missouri, and some of my old friends with MDC and NRCS would be glad to hear this. You know, in Missouri, we have clients in Missouri, you know, if they ask me about seeding a warm season grass, I pretty well try to steer them to doing the native tall grasses.
So Jim, we had a couple of questions put in the chat, kind of talking about specific grasses. So one of them is Albion perennial ryegrass, and the other one was Tiffany teff grass. Asking about your thoughts on both of those.
Albon, unless we're misunderstanding the term, Albon is a variety of cereal rye. There may be an Albion perennial ryegrass. I don't remember that one specifically there. Teff is a nice warm season grass, probably a little better suited for hay than it is for grazing. As they, you know, do some selections out of it, we're getting more grazing type teff. But it's got a fairly broad growing window. It's a much finer stemmed grass compared to the millets, the sorghums, and that, and so that helps the digestibility of it. We are increasingly putting it into the summer cocktail mixes, you know, in our recommendations. So teff is, in my view, a usable and valuable grass.
Jim, just something that kind of struck me as you were talking about seeding down pasture ground. Of course, we've got some different novel endophyte fescues anymore. What would be your kind of recommendation if specifically Missouri, but we could say the greater Midwest if you're talking about seeding down a piece of ground?
Well, I always differentiate between North Missouri and South Missouri. still, because the soils are so different north of the Missouri River compared to south of the Missouri River. In North Missouri, a novel endophyte fescue, and preferably one of the soft-leafed fescues, a heat-tolerant, late-maturing orchard grass. I think those two make a really solid combination for the base of the pasture. I don't know that meadow brome grass has made really any inroads into Missouri. We had meadow brome grass in one variety trial when I was at Linnaeus, and it did persist and produce. The most interesting thing about it was because our variety plots at that time were not fenced to exclude the deer, the meadow brome was definitely the most preferred grass in the variety trial over the winter. It was kept chewed down to about 1 inch height. You know, orchard grass would have been 3 inches tall or something, perennial ryegrass, fescue, other things, but they loved the meadow brome grass. I honestly don't know if anyone is growing meadow brome in Missouri, but if it would grow and persist there, I would throw that in the mix also. And then for legumes in North Missouri, big fan of birdsfoot trefoil. The red clover, the white clovers go there. All over South Missouri, red clover, white clovers do pretty well. Throw in the annual Lespedeza in also. In South Missouri, I've seen a lot of good orchard grass down there. Within the species of orchard grass, there's tremendous variation in cultivars. And so for South Missouri, I would definitely be looking for the more drought tolerant, heat tolerant orchard grass varieties. In North Missouri, yeah, that's a consideration, but I'd take a higher energy, more digestible orchard grass in North Missouri and sacrifice some of the heat tolerance. But in South Missouri, probably the heat tolerant, drought tolerant aspect of the particular orchard grass variety would be real important in making a choice of what variety to use.
So it looks like we've had a couple more questions about one of them, establishing teff in a cocktail situation. How do you establish teff in a cocktail situation?
It just goes in when the full seed mix, when you're doing it, it would just be a component in there.
Second question that came through, if you're grazing sheep and cattle together, do you tend to like to put them together to graze through a system, or do you do a leader follower type system?
You know, I've done it all three ways: the sheep and cattle actually going together, the sheep ahead of the cattle, or the cattle ahead of the sheep. It depends on what the stage of production is and what the animal's particular needs are. One of the places where it's a good idea to run sheep behind cattle is if you have broadleaf weed issues that you're really wanting the sheep to address. That would be a scenario where we would definitely run them separately with the sheep behind, so that the broadleaves that the cattle may have left behind, the sheep are going to need to use that rather than getting a first choice at the grass. Times when I have run sheep ahead of cattle on stockpile pasture, you know, in the fall, because the cows are already bred, but we're getting the sheep ready to breed. We can put sheep ahead of the cattle to take the highest quality feed out of the stockpile. That's kind of a flushing factor as we're getting ready to breed the ewes. So there's a situation where you put the ewes in front. So the answer is, I don't think I've said it all night, is it depends.
It's a typical extension answer. So as you've kind of talked about a lot of your species, I haven't heard anything about any types of alfalfas or grazing type alfalfas. I get a lot of questions about that, about you know, whether you should or you shouldn't use any alfalfas in your mix.
Okay, I'm quite frankly not a fan of alfalfa in a grazing mix. And the reason why is alfalfa is rapid recovery in the summer, which is a good and wonderful thing, right? It can be high quality at the appropriate harvest stage. But what my experience ended up being with alfalfa, and we started doing grazing trials, alfalfa grazing trials at Linnaeus in the year that I arrived, 1981. We may have started in 82, but we seeded the pastures in 81. And what I've seen in a lot of different environments over a lot of different pastures and years is if you have alfalfa in a mix and you manage the pasture based on trying to optimize the utilization of the alfalfa, I'll guarantee you that you will overgraze the grasses and you will lose the grasses out of the stand. If, on the other hand, you say, okay, I'm going to sacrifice the alfalfa quality and I'm going to focus on managing my grasses, your alfalfa the stem digestibility is going to be so low by the time the stock get to it. Basically, they strip the leaves and you're left with stem standing of unutilized alfalfa out there. And if it's a strong component in the pasture, there can be so much of those unutilized stems left that it becomes a detriment to the grazing of the animals in the next cycle. So I'm pretty well, we don't, now we put alfalfa into dry land mixes out here in once a year grazing scenarios. That's the only place that I'm currently recommending alfalfa in grazing mixes.
Very good. Had another question submitted about your suggestions for a cover crop in northern Missouri for grazing. What would be some of your
the first question is going to be, are we talking about a cool season cover crop or a warm season cover crop? And that's going to make a difference. And then I'm just going to say, in either one of those scenarios, I want to have several grasses, several forbs, a few legumes, and brassicas. We like diversity. We like a mix of everything.
We get a lot of back and forth in North Missouri on your rye grasses. Most of your row crop farmers will call it nothing but a weed. A lot of your grazers tend to like your rye grasses. So I assume you would be one of those that would kind of be in favor of the ryegrass family or not?
Oh, I am. I eat a lot more beef than I do cornflakes.
Very good. So you made a reference on the warm season grasses in Missouri, and Missouri is a very, very diverse state. You cross the river, it gets a whole lot different. Do you like your warm season grasses on either sides of the river in Missouri, or are you more, do they make more sense north or south, or is there, do you see a discernible difference?
Maybe a little higher percentage of your pastures in the south as warm season. Now, on our farm there in Lynn County, our personal farm, not talking about the research station, on our personal farm, the most productive pastures that we had were native remnant prairie with a strong cool season invasion in it. In terms of grazing, in those days I was doing cow days per acre. In terms of cow days per acre, that's what generated the most feed for us, was something that had native grasses and cool seasons, including fescue, in them. What I generally do is, because I'm also about year-round grazing, is I look at how many days of the year would you consider optimum for growing warm season grasses, and you take that percentage of 365, and that's the percentage of your pastures that approximately should be in warm season grasses. So there might be places in South Missouri where you say, really 45% of the year, I'm in a warm season growing environment. So down there on the Missouri-Arkansas border, maybe 45% of the acres should be in warm season grasses. And of course, I'm doing simple math here and presuming that the warm season and the cool season are of equal productivity. They may or may not be. So it's really of the total animal unit days that you need to provide, how much of it would be optimized grazing warm season, growing and grazing warm season, how much cool season. You get up on the Missouri-Iowa line and, maybe that percentage drops to just 25 to 30% as warm season. And so you're looking at 70% of the feed coming from cool season. But that's the way I look at it, is you look at what the distribution of your feed demand is going to be, and then how many days of the year would it be desirable to have that coming from warm season. I saw a lot of people in South Missouri when I was there who I thought were getting carried away with the amount of warm season grass they wanted to put in. Because there is still, at least when I lived in Missouri, there was still winter south of the river. I guess this year there is.
I think this year there's winter everywhere. Well, Val, I'm not seeing any more questions. You have anything you'd like to add before we close out for the evening?
I don't have anything else. Thank you.
Very good.
Well, thank you everyone who came, and thanks for your questions. We'll look forward to the next time that I can be there in real life.
Well, Jim, we hope that comes soon, and we want to thank you for being a speaker this year in the virtual symposium. Again, we want to thank all of our sponsors. If you want to go back and look at some of the other sessions we've had, please visit MissouriLivestock.com, and also visit the virtual trade show while you're there, and recognize all the sponsors, because this wouldn't be possible without the support of them. So I think I'll close for the evening and say thanks again to Jim. And Jim, we hope you stay safe, you stay warm until we can have you back in Missouri, man.
All right. Thanks, Zach. Thanks, Valerie. And it was a pleasure and an honor. We'll see you another day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jim. We'll conclude for the evening.